But we're going to move quickly now to the commentary. And this is coming from Matthew Gibney from the University of Oxford. I think now still the director of the Refugee Studies Center there. And Matthew, in addition to being a professor at Oxford, also happens to be Australian. So we've tried to mix this up a little bit to make sure we don't have all Australians or all Americans or too many nationalities on any one chapter or panel. So Matt has the special attribute of actually being Australian. So Matt.
G'day.
G'day.
I was wondering why I was chosen. Thank you for that. National origins still as alive and well here. Take note, Dan. It's a great honour to be a discussant for a paper that has not yet been written. It involves a little bit of anticipation in my, on my part.
Hanging on every word.
But when I spoke to Jim about this, which was dangerously close to this workshop taking place, he said a good way to go about it would be to comment on the last chapter a little bit, in terms particularly of updating it, in terms of the issues that have been raised over the last 8 years or so. So that's really what I intend to do in large part. Though some of what I say runs a little bit across what Phil has said, and certainly I think raises issues that have resonated this morning, particularly with the discussion of Canada. So I think in many respects, Castles and Vasta's chapter holds up pretty well, 8 or so years on. They titled their chapter at the time, Australia, a Classical Immigration Country in Transition. And they described a country that had embraced and been transformed by immigration in terms of its ethnic composition, in terms of its population size, in terms of its, I suppose, street-level culture, and in terms of public policy. Yet at the same time, they identified the fact that Australians themselves, or at least a large proportion of them, have very mixed feelings about immigration, and that the Australian population periodically showed that they saw immigration as a threat and as a challenge to the Australian way of life, at least at the point they ended their story in around about 2011. Now, Castles and Vasta, like many observers, including myself, a few years ago in one chapter which I did write on the topic of Australia for my book, saw this ambivalence as practically manifested in government policies that welcomed immigration as beneficial for economic growth and especially skilled migration, but also constantly reassured the public that migration could be managed, orderly, secure, and importantly, under political control. And this dual imperative is very long running in the Australian context, dating back at least to the, at the time, reluctant expansion of the Australian immigration program to Southern Europeans in the early 1950s. Southern Europeans were considered somewhat less, actually a great deal less than Northern Europeans, but the program expanded in that way for reasons that Phil has mentioned here. But in recent decades, this kind of, I suppose, this kind of compact, this kind of balance between these two considerations has met new challenges posed by unauthorised arrivals, concerns about Islamist terrorism, reduced trust in government and the rise of populist parties with at least a strong nativist tinge, and rising levels of temporary migration in the country. For all that Castles and Vasta could identify a country in transition, it was much less clear exactly what Australia was transitioning to. And I'm not sure I'm going to be all that much help in answering that question either, but perhaps we could tease it out at some point. Mm-hmm. But let's start by noting one really important thing relevant to assessing Australia 8 years on from the last edition of Controlling Migration. In terms of many of the fundamental markers, levels of permanent migration, temporary migration, and refugee entrance, not that much has changed. During the 2019 Australian national election campaign, the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, campaigned on a pledge to cap new permanent arrivals at 160,000 people annually for the next 4 years. This was supposed to be a sign of his seriousness in keeping migration levels under control. But his commitment was only 8,000 people shy of the annual admittance level in 2011, when the last edition was written. That said, over this time, as in Canada, there had been a slight move in favour of skilled migrants over family migrants. It's currently about a 70%, 30% balance, but it's not a dramatic move in that direction yet. And the number didn't include the temporary migration of students, which is, as Phil said, big business in the Australian context. Student visas run at around 350,000 annually, which is little more than the 320,000 given by Castles and Vasta for the last year that they have, which is 2008-2009. When it comes to humanitarian admissions, a category that includes asylum seekers and resettled refugees, we have plus ça change déjà vu, if I might connect two phrases. Morrison, the Prime Minister, has committed to keeping refugee admissions at 18,750 a year, a figure that is somewhat higher than the 14,000 registered in 2008-9, the last time period to which the chapter refers. In the main, these admissions targets on permanent and temporary immigration were not contested by the Labor opposition during the last election campaign. It's true that when it came to refugees, the opposition would have raised the overall level to 27,000, but they didn't question the government's brutal and controversial policies of turning back unauthorised boat arrivals, and there was no commitment to closing Nauru, the offshore refugee detention and processing centre. There has then, I think we can say, been consistency in terms of immigration levels recently, and for the most part, a kind of consensus between the two major political parties. But this doesn't mean that the last decade or so has passed without controversy, nor that no new policy directions have been taken. Less still that political actors, particularly from the right, including the ruling Liberal government, have not from time to time deliberately stirred societal anxiety about immigration, nor that it has been particularly hard to do so. The respected Lowy Institute in Sydney conducted a poll on public attitudes to immigration last year that found that for the first time in 15 years, a majority of respondents supported a stop on immigration to the country. And while this view isn't yet entirely reflected in the positions of the major parties, it does find support on the populist right, in Pauline Hanson's One Nation party in particular, and it's possible is a future trend. Now, over the last 10 years, 3 immigration-related issues have been at the forefront of discussion over immigration, and I think have served to reflect some pretty profound divisions within Australian society. The first is the effect of immigration on major cities. It's increasingly common, as Phil mentioned, to hear complaints voiced by politicians, media, and the public that population growth within Australia, due to immigration in particular, is placing great stress on infrastructure in the major cities. Traffic jams, creaking public transport, and of course extremely high house prices are common subjects of conversation in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. And these raise questions about Australia's ideal population size. This is sometimes, but not always, but on the right it is definitely, accompanied by concerns that some areas are becoming dominated by particular immigrant groups as well. A second issue is that since the early 2000s, the centre of gravity of ethnic and racial concern about migration has shifted from cultural concerns about Asian migration to anxiety about Muslim immigrants in the population. These concerns, which are happily exploited and exacerbated by nativist groups such as One Nation, which itself beautifully pivoted from being concerned about Asian migration to Muslims within the population after September 11th. These questions typically revolve, as one might expect, revolve around questions of integration and security. Terrorist attacks, not least the Martin Place attack in Sydney in 2011, have helped fuel these concerns, and Australia's had a number of events of this time. Notoriously, the Queensland Senator Fraser Anning released a statement shortly after the recent Christchurch mosque bombing, attacks within New Zealand, blaming these on the immigration program which allowed Muslim fanatics to migrate to New Zealand in the first place. His statement was ridiculed, but he had his supporters, most of whom lay low at the time. Most overt Islamophobia is confined to the far right of Australian politics, but more widespread doubts are echoed in government, in the media, and in the broad public about whether Muslims will properly integrate into Australian life, given their so-called common views on women, homosexuality, and the question of foreign loyalties. Third, the issue of unauthorised boat arrivals remains a hot topic, particularly the hosting of aspirant Australian asylum seekers offshore on Nauru and Manus Island. Since 2012, 4,177 people have been sent to Nauru or to Papua New Guinea as part of offshore processing arrangements. Many of these under Labor governments, but a substantial number also under Liberal governments. I should say that the Liberal government in the context of Australia means the Conservative side of politics. And politically, the issue remains a controversial one, with the Liberal government eager to use asylum seekers as a wedge issue to distinguish itself from the Labor Party. In turn, the Labor leadership has basically imitated the government's hard line on the question of offshore processing and turnbacks, which are effectively refoulement under international law. Despite division in the party, they've adopted this line in order really to neutralise it as an issue during elections. The detention of children on Nauru, frequent suicides by refugees there, and the longevity of people being held there has made the issue a lightning rod for international criticism by human rights, civil society organisations, as well as substantial sections of the Australian public. So these three concerns have been at the forefront then of government discussion of immigrant issues over the last 10 years. And they point to the following general questions. Is Australia nearing the limit of immigration if a healthy population size is to be achieved? What are the appropriate rules that should govern the behaviour of immigrants and non-citizens who wish to reside in the country? How far is the state entitled to go to deter and even to punish those who break rules related to admission to and residence within Australian society? Now, I think developments in government policy recently, particularly over the last decade, give us some insight into how these questions, which are in no way new, are currently being answered. So rather than restricting immigration as such, governments have innovated to address the problem of congestion in major cities and population size. And perhaps the best example of this is the current Morrison government's new designated area migration agreement visas, which are designed to direct immigrants to underpopulated parts of the continent, including the Northern Territory and South Australia, something that would send horror through the minds of people from Melbourne or Sydney, like myself. The new visa scheme enables regional authorities to offer work opportunities to meet a range of shortages for skilled and semi-skilled workers. The numbers involved are currently small. They were around 8,000 this year. There'll be around 23,000 next year. But the scheme is growing and being rolled out much more generally. And crucially, it's worth saying, to ensure that those on these visas remain outside major cities, new immigrants on them must work for at least 3 years in their designated region to access permanent residence and thus be on the path to citizenship. So this is clearly a novel attempt, novel at least for over the last 30 years to shape the pattern of settlement. Now, in terms of the rules for joining Australian society, governments have increasingly used deportation and exclusion under the Good Character section 501 of Australia's Migration Act to promote appropriate behaviour by non-citizens. This section itself is not new, but as a result of a December 2002 legislative change, expulsion from Australia is now mandatory for non-citizens sentenced to a period of jail of 12 months or more. And this provision, along with more vigorous enforcement of all character-based deportations generally, has led to rising numbers of deportations and exclusions, multiple increases, sometimes of people who've spent virtually all of their lives in Australia. Now, the aim of this policy is clearly on one level to reassure the Australian public that immigration-related mistakes and the admission of the undesirable can be reflected or can be fixed after arrival by getting rid of mistakes. But the practice has also generated international controversy. Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, which is the country which has, believe it or not, the highest number of deportees from Australia, stated that the policy was having a corrosive effect on relations between the two countries. Her concern was that many of the deportees, given the length of time that they'd spent there, were really Australia's responsibility. There have also been notable developments in access to citizenship. Castles and Vasta observed a move away from Australia's signature policy of easy access in the last edition, with a change from a 2-year to a 4-year residency requirement and the introduction of an Australian values test with questions about loyalty and commitment to so-called Australian values. And more restrictive rules now appear to be on the way. In 2017, the Liberal government presented a bill to Parliament that would further toughen access to citizenship, making 4 years of permanent residence obligatory for citizenship applicants and introducing a new standalone English test. This test itself has proven very controversial, and the bill has been blocked in the Senate on the grounds that the test is too demanding. It's possible that the bill will pass in the new Parliament. Under Liberal governments, have I got a little bit more time? Under Liberal governments, and this is an issue that I think probably runs across a number of countries here, it's also become easier to lose citizenship, with Australia introducing new denationalisation powers for dual nationals associated with terrorist activities, a 2015 law, is consistent with recent legislation across a number of European states, though the number of people directly subjected to the power has been relatively small so far. However, and it's worth pointing this out, new legislation is currently being drafted by the Morrison government, which will increase denationalisation power further. And the government has indicated or suggested, placed out into the public realm, that these new provisions will allow for the loss of citizenship even for mononationals, in spite of international norms on statelessness. I think they're thieving from UK policy here. Finally, on the question of how far a state may go to deter those who break the rules, there have been developments in the realm of offshore processing of refugees. As I've noted, this has become a lightning rod for international criticism. And while this isn't normally considered a problem for Australian governments wanting to convince their public that they're tough on unwanted arrivals, some efforts have been made by Australian governments to take the teeth out of this criticism. First up has been that the Australian government committed itself under great pressure in 2017 to getting all children out of immigration detention on Nauru. And early last year, the last 4 were resettled in the US, bringing to an end, at least for the time being, a prickly human rights issue, though many of those children have just ended up in Australian detention centres. Furthermore, there have been ongoing attempts by the government to reduce the numbers on these islands without bringing these refugees onto Australia. They've been encouraged to return back home, even after gaining refugee status, released into the local community in Papua New Guinea, and being provided with resettlement packages with other countries, notably Cambodia. And most publicly, as you may be aware, Australia made a very well-publicised deal with the US to take a substantial proportion of Nauru detainees for resettlement to the US in return for Australia taking some US refugees onto its territory. And upon coming to office, I only have less than a page left, Donald Trump ridiculed the deal in a phone call with the Australian Prime Minister of the time, and then in a tweet described it as Obama's dumb deal. As of March 2019, only 859 people remain on Nauru, and the Australian government appears to be inching towards the end game here. So let me finish just by returning to this question of Australia as an immigration country in transition. It's clear that almost 10 years after this chapter was last written, Australia does remain very much a kind of immigration settler country. Large numbers of permanent residents, refugees, temporary migrants and family reunion cases still arrive annually, and the dominant view in government is still, at least for the time being, that large-scale migration, particularly of the skilled, is beneficial to Australian society and economy. Yet we see simultaneously a continued trend towards harsher conditions being placed on the arrival and residence of those immigrants that come. Citizenship has been harder to gain, deportation has become easier, greater restrictions are placed on residents, and unauthorised residence is treated very harshly indeed. It's tempting to say then that the price of keeping Australia a country of immigration is policies towards non-citizens that are increasingly tough and more illiberal every year. This is, however, a little facile. It takes no account of the way that restrictive measures serve other goals for political elites rather than just legitimising open immigration policies. But it captures something important about the Australian experiences and I think offers some insight into the kind of country that Australia is transitioning into.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.